I'm going to talk about this man, Eli Lilly. I never thought that I would want to write a biography of him. After all, he was, to my mind, a typical wealthy businessman, very traditional, very conservative, lived all his life in Indianapolis. There'd be no stories there, I thought. Why write about him? And I got to figure out where I'm going to point this to make it work. And that is the right button. Whoa, that worked too well. That's way ahead of where we want to go. Here's where we want to go. Here's what he wrote to someone who asked about writing his biography while he was still alive. My life is boring. He said it himself. I won't tell you why I decided to write a biography of him, but I did. And I spent many, many mornings driving from Bloomington to the south side of Indianapolis to McCarty Street, where the company archives were. Spent many, many mornings, days, reading Eli Lilly's mail, which is what historians do. And it was just fascinating to me. I want to acknowledge that the company generously gave me access to the archives, which was a great, great privilege, and really free reign in that archives. And never once did Eli Lilly and Company tell me what to write, or look at what I have written, or approve it or disapprove it. And that is a little bit unusual and really, really special. And I'm eternally grateful for that. I should also say, for the benefit of both the company and my integrity, that to this day I've still not taken a penny from Eli Lilly and Company. I guess I'm waiting. Maybe the check's in the mail. But that's actually the kind of relationship that a scholar wants to have when it comes to this kind of a project. Let me begin with some basic facts, some key features of this man's life, and then move to some larger issues and questions. And the first thing we need to do, yes, there we go, is sort out which Lilly, because it is, this is a delay, right? I'll figure this out. I'm an immigrant to this technology. Some of you are too. This gets perhaps even more confused these days than it did when these three generations of Lillys were around. So I need to sort out who we're talking about here. This is the three generations that are of most relevance. The colonel at the top, his son, and the two sons at the bottom. The colonel, and that's the way people referred to him because he actually was a real colonel from Indiana in the Civil War, a serious military officer in the most serious war this nation has ever fought. Colonel Eli Lilly had a son, Josiah J.K. Lilly, and J.K. had two sons, Eli, the one I'm going to talk about, and a brother, J.K. Jr. So you got that? You ready to pass the exam on the Lilly genealogy now? Grandfather, Eli Lilly, the colonel. Three generations. This guy here is the one I'm interested in. Born in 1885, went and graduated from Shortridge High School, and most of you know what I mean when I say Shortridge High School back in the day. Off to the nation's best pharmacy school, the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. Graduated in 1907, immediately came back and joined the company that his grandfather had founded and that his father was the president of. And this is what it looked like at the beginning, just off Washington Street in an alleyway. There's several key characteristics of Eli Lilly Company in these first decades, and I've got several chapters in the book on that. I'm going to go through this very quickly and just say if you're really deeply interested in this, and I actually find it very fascinating, but not all people do, you have to read the book. So a couple of the key points. This, for several decades, was one among hundreds, thousands of drug companies in the country, an uncountable number. And most of them, all of them, were making products that were not efficacious. That it was junk. It was alcohol. It was opium. But it certainly wasn't anything that was going to cure any of the diseases. Here is Eli Lilly and Company's best-selling product in 1907 when young Eli joined the firm, Sucus Alterans. It was purportedly derived from a secret Indian remedy. It was a blood purifier. It treated rheumatism, eczema, syphilis, and numerous other conditions. It's a concoction. And this is not just this company, it's all the companies in the business. This changed rapidly. In fact, I use the word revolution. The changes were revolutionary. And this young man was at the center of those changes. Not alone, but he was the driving force. He was the leader who saw the future, who led the firm toward these massive innovations. There are really two revolutions that occur on McCarty Street at the company in the 1910s and 1920s. The first is mass production. A familiar notion to all of us today, but really a revolutionary idea at the time. And this young whippersnapper had a passion for it, for efficiency. He installed all kinds of new technology, assembly lines, and equipment, and pushed for scientific management. The crowning achievement here was this building, number 20. They still number all the buildings down there. At the corner of McCarty and Delaware, it still stands. This was one of his great, great achievements. Now, if all of this have been done just to produce more Sucus Alterans, the company would not have been in business. It was essential, this mass production, but it wasn't sufficient. And that's the second revolution. It's research and development. In the late 1910s, there was a rapidly changing environment in science and in the pharmaceutical industry, and this company moved aggressively into that scientific environment. The first step, the first major step, was to hire an English-born and German-educated, a PhD from a German university, which at that time was the finest scientific chemical training in the world. Young Eli convinced him to come to Indianapolis. And his name, of course, was George Henry Alexander Clowes. He arrived in the summer of 1919. A distinguished research scientist with a huge ego. The company in those days had a policy that you had to park in your assigned place. One employee remembered much later, Dr. Clowes parked his darn automobile anywhere he wished, and no one said anything to him. Clowes produced results. He left Indianapolis at Christmas 1921 and went off to Yale to a scientific meeting where he heard a paper by some Toronto scientists on diabetes and insulin. He came back by May of 22, young Eli Lilly. And from now on, when I say Eli Lilly, I mean the grandson of Colonel Lilly. Young Lilly and Clowes were making frequent trips by train from Indianapolis to Toronto, working with these scientists over a period of many months. They created together the first ever in this country, the first ever large-scale research collaboration between university scientists on the one hand and industrial pharmaceutical scientists and business leaders on the other hand. These were not natural partners. There were difficulties in the cultural differences, in the purposes and the missions of these two sides, but they worked it out, and Eli Lilly was the major player in making those arrangements work. What followed were hard days here in Indianapolis, setting up production, moving to large-scale production, moving to consistency and other issues. But by the spring of 1923, the company had solved the basic problem. The Toronto scientists won the Nobel Prize. Eli Lilly and Company had insulin with revolutionary consequences. Diabetics lived. It was a death sentence until then. Absolute death sentence. Diabetics lived. And at McCarty Street, the profits soared. As early as 1923, insulin counted for half of the company's sales. By 1930, the company was second only to Parke Davis, probably, in pharmaceutical company size and sales in the United States. And in addition, a new prestige, a new respectability in the scientific community that led to new products on McCarty Street. Eli Lilly and Company became a big business, a successful business. Most pharmaceutical companies did not. Most went out of business. They did not make that transition. Much later in his life, Eli Lilly looked back and said that this was the most satisfying and creative period of my life. He had proven himself. He'd proven himself to his father, who sometimes resisted some of these changes, J.K. Lilly Sr. He'd proven himself to his brother. He'd proven himself to older employees. He was, without doubt, a great business leader. And he was not a happy man. He later wrote in these years, these are his words, filled with venom and poison. He's in his 30s. He's very hard driving, very intense, very impatient. He's we would say, a workaholic. He was not well liked by many of his employees and associates. Even his father got impatient with him and reprimanded him. His employees feared him. He had a temper. He would shout and swear. He would kick things. He'd throw things against the wall. He would, on occasion, fire an employee on the spot. His personal life was a mess. He married his high school sweetheart, Evelyn Fortune, in 1907, just when he came to join the company. She was the daughter of William Fortune, a well-known civic leader in Indianapolis, and a close Lilly family friend. William Fortune was the first non-family member permitted to buy stock in Eli Lilly and Company. Eli and Evelyn had two sons, both named Eli. Both died in infancy. In 1918, they had a daughter. They named her Evie. By the early 1920s, Evie's parents were drifting apart. She wanted to travel. She wanted to have parties. She wanted a social life. Her husband wanted to work. In 1926, Eli Lilly and Evelyn Fortune Lilly divorced. When Eli mentioned the possibility of his father, J.K. Sr. threatened to disinherit him. He never told his mother. He never talked about the divorce with his mother. This was a scandal in the families and in this town. Everyone knew them. Divorce was not the way you lived your lives in 1926. Indeed, when I wrote about this in the 1980s, there was still some sensitivity on the subject. Some people who said, you really shouldn't write about this, you really shouldn't talk about this. Evelyn did very well. An amazing woman. I interviewed her at her home in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and at her home in Beverly, Massachusetts. One of the most amazing oral history interviews I've done in my life. Smart, lively, articulate, with a wonderful memory of Indianapolis in these days, and very wealthy. She remarried a man named Frederic Bartlett. He was an artist, very wealthy himself, and a collector of art, especially French Impressionism. Some of you, most of you, will know the painting Sunday Afternoon in the Park by George Seurat. That was Frederic Bartlett's painting, among many others. When I was interviewing Evelyn Fortune Lilly Bartlett, she told me that the Art Institute of Chicago, which had, and eventually that's where they gave the paintings, and you can still see Sunday Afternoon in the Park there, as well as many others of Frederic Bartlett's paintings, had just contacted her and said they were thinking about putting all those paintings in a room, and they'd like to call it the Frederic Bartlett Room. And you all know what this meant. Are you going to write a check, Mrs. Bartlett? And she said, I'm going to write a check. I have to write a check. And I don't know what the size of the check was, but I'm sure it was very substantial. And when you go in that room at the Art Institute, look up, and that's what the name of the room is to this day. So Evelyn did very well. There was one unhappy person after this divorce, and that was young Evie. She was 7. She learned on the playground that her parents were going to divorce. She was taunted. She felt unloved. She felt she should have been a boy. Her father and her mother indulged her. Evelyn hosted a coming out party for Evie in 1937 at the Ritz-Carlton in Boston. Eli tried to match that with a second coming out debut here in Indianapolis in 1937, a week of parties at the Sunset Lane house. They rented the wooden floor of the Butler Field House for a dance floor on the front lawn, and they hired an orchestra so the kids could dance. And you can probably recognize it's a grainy photograph, but that is Benny Goodman playing on Sunset Lane at Evie's coming out party. You explain this to younger people, you say, well, it's like hiring Beyonce and Katie Parks. Sorry, I should get my act together when I go there, shouldn't I? The sadness here is that it didn't really help Evie very much. She remained all her life a troubled person, several unsuccessful marriages, too much alcohol, other bad choices. Her father eventually decided he could not trust her with large sums of money with no strings. He left her no inheritance, though she was very well, Evie's problems were not money, very well provided for. One of the saddest, maybe the saddest document I read at Eli Lilly and Company archives was a letter that Eli wrote to his brother Joe to be opened in the event that Eli died first. He didn't. Joe never saw it, never read it. I read it. It was an explanation. He never talked to Joe about Evie and about Evie's problems and what it meant for him. And he poured out his heart in this unread letter intended for his brother. He loved his daughter. Her unhappiness, I believe, was the greatest disappointment of his life, and he blamed himself. The divorce, overindulgence, other causes. This is important because in many ways, I believe, I'm convinced, that Eli Lilly's life became an effort to respond to what he saw to be Evie's problems and his own failures as a father, to find ways for other people, young people especially, to live good lives. Now, he found his own personal happiness in a second marriage to Ruth Allison, who was his secretary. This is not the Ruth Lilly that you know, likely. That's his niece. That's the Ruth Lilly, the philanthropist who passed away a few years ago, is the great-granddaughter of the colonel and the niece of Eli Lilly. This is Ruth Allison Lilly. It's a very complicated naming system, isn't it? Who was Eli Lilly's second wife and who had a long and exceedingly happy marriage, a healing personally that came with his love for Ruth and for their good marriage. It included building his home on Sunset Lane. This is the front lawn where Benny Goodman paid. Incidentally, and his father commented on this, he built this home about the same time that Joe was purchasing Oldfields right next door here, whichever way we are. And yes, indeed, there was sibling rivalry between the sons. They had a brotherly relationship with all its ups and downs. So I say, this is not all Hollywood gossip. This is important because through this personal crisis that occurred in the late 1920s, he began to take stock of himself, to examine his life, to read, to think. He knew that he had disadvantages in a narrow technical education rather than a broad liberal arts education. He developed a strong prejudice in favor of a liberal arts education. He regretted that too many universities, these are his words, too many universities were declining into the mere training of specialists for career roles. Boy, would I double underline that statement today. He knew how much he did not know, which I think is one of the great benefits for those of us who can understand that, and he worked very hard to learn. He began to read, to think, to talk, to learn things he could not have learned in a pharmacy school. In 1934, he wrote down some of his emerging thoughts. When I found this document in the archives, and many days you sit there and I drive back to Indianapolis saying, what did I do today? You know, bits and pieces, but not a whole lot. This was a memorable day. Opening this folder. And the title was Plan for Developing a Proper Outlook on Life. He sat and wrote this in 1934 with sentences like this. We can change our habits. With sufficient willpower, determination, we can change our life. And it wasn't we, it was I. I can change my life, he was saying. And he worked at it. He borrowed, for example, from Benjamin Franklin. He loved Franklin's autobiography, and it's one of the great reads in America, I think. A chart. Ben Franklin did this. A chart on which to note every evening the virtues you had practiced that day. Lilly started to do that. Deliberate, self-conscious efforts. A sustained effort for the rest of his life. He worked at this. To ask who he was. What did he value? Rather than just to accept what other people told him or expected of him. Now, there's in this little of the kind of self-absorption or woolly navel-gazing. He was not interested in displaying this to others. He was a very private man. He was not ostentatious, in fact, in any sense. It's true that he did buy a Rolls Royce, but in the archives, among all this paper, was the service record for his Rolls. He drove it over a period of 12 years, only 30,000 miles. He much preferred early on his Nash Rambler to his Rolls. His favorite drink was Coca-Cola. He liked eating in the company cafeteria. In examining his life, in a search for a proper outlook, he found his passions. Now, he worked very hard, continued to work very hard at what he called the pill factory, and the company remained his passion, but he added others. Now, there's another issue here, of course, which you all know, and that is money. By the mid-1930s, his income was well over $1 million, when $1 million really was $1 million. And after World War II, it went up astronomically in that period of sustained American prosperity. He became a very wealthy man. What to do with all that money? He wrote Evie, when she turned 21, that it sounds easy to give away money, but it's really not. You have to study. You have to think about what you're giving your money to. And in his case, he spent a lot of time thinking and studying that, and he evolved his own principles of philanthropy. Philanthropy that was close rather than a distance. Philanthropy that was physically close. Indianapolis, Indiana in particular. Personally close, with individuals, with people that he knew and came to trust. Not just the institutions, but the individual who was the leader and the face of the institution. It was very important to him. and he believed that giving should be confidential and private. He kept his name off most of his gifts, unannounced. Seldom did he allow his name on a building, a program, an event. Even his closest friends had only little bits and pieces of knowledge as to where he had given money. There came to be several areas, 3 perhaps, of his key interests, all centered around his, what he called character education or character development. How do people develop good character, good moral values, good spiritual values, a proper outlook on life? How do you get that? How do children develop that? What is a well-lived life? Now, he spent the rest of his life thinking and reading about that, but came up, of course, with no easy answers. He rounded up, cynics might say, the usual suspects. The Sermon on the Mount, for example, which he very much liked. The dangers of materialism and selfishness. Peer pressure, especially among younger people. It was a quixotic quest, some said. But he stuck to it. He kept pounding away at it. And it was the center of his giving, of his philanthropy, this search for character and values and a proper outlook on life. Eventually, 3 particular areas emerged as the main objects of his philanthropy, and of the Lilly Endowment, I should say, which he founded in 1937. His father and his brother joined him, but Eli was the driving force in founding the endowment and really in running the endowment until his death. And people tell me long after he passed away, Eli Lilly's presence was at the center of the endowment's policies, and some might even suggest remains so. So 3 areas: religion, and you probably know these or some of it. He was attracted to theologians and clergy of belief and of action. And the best example of that, there's the endowment. The best example of that is this young man, Paul Moore, who came to Indianapolis in 1957. One of the most amazing people I've interviewed, and I was so privileged to be able to interview Paul Moore. He was a Marine at Guadalcanal where he had a nasty, nasty wound. He believed, he told me, that it was Lilly Company penicillin that saved his life on Guadalcanal. He came to Indianapolis in 1957 to Christ Church on the Circle. Very progressive, very liberal, especially so on matters of race, at a time when Indianapolis was still very, very segregated, when African Americans could not check into most of the hotels in town or eat in the restaurants or in other kinds of ways participate in the life of this city. Moore led programs to encourage African Americans to attend Christ Church, outreach, engagement, and education in the community. All this happened only because Eli Lilly approved of it and encouraged and supported Moore. Among the most amazing relationships the 2 men each had in their lives. And I got so into this that I ended up, there's a whole chapter about this relationship in the biography. So religion, education, particularly colleges in Indiana and especially the liberal arts colleges, Wabash, Earlham, and the others. And then history, and this is another reason why I guess I like this guy so much, to confess. All kinds of historical projects and endeavors, a focus on the Indiana Historical Society. And it didn't look at all like that. It looks like that now because that's Eli Lilly's money that built the Taj Mahal, the Hoosier Taj Mahal, as I call it. But it's not just his money. And it's not primarily his money in so many ways. It was his engagement in history, in Indiana history, in the Indiana Historical Society, in its publications. One of my favorites, and it wouldn't have happened without him, is the Diary of Calvin Fletcher. Calvin Fletcher was a early, mid-19th century Indianapolis resident, businessman, politician, involved in everything. phenomenal individual and an amazing diary. If you like to read diaries, just read a few pages before you fall asleep at night. Find out what was happening in the middle of January in 1842 in Indianapolis, because Calvin will tell you. And then he'll go on to report his sins of the day and how he let down one of his sons and other kinds of soap opera family things that also make it kind of interesting. Lilly himself continued reading, writing history, and other subjects. In his study, there were thousands of books. His study in Sunset Lane, many of them with his notes. I spent several days there pulling these books off the shelves, and they were scribbled in his handwriting, in ink often, underlined, and comments in the margins. He didn't buy books to collect first editions the way his brother J.K. Jr. did. He bought them to read. He kept a shining phrase book where he wrote down quotations, phrases that he liked, and he used them in his own writings then and in his speeches and talks. He worked very hard in his writing. He wrote a history of Christ Church, a history of Lake Wawasee, an archaeological history, Heinrich Schlieman's diary when he came to Indianapolis, and other publications. Many of these strands came together when he got interested in William Connor's house, the first brick house in central Indiana, built in 1823, falling down during the Great Depression. He bought it, he restored it, he saved it, and soon he was recreating pioneer America in 20th century Hamilton County. This is part of his quest for character, for values, and how you inculcate them in young children. In 1960, he led in the formation of Indiana Landmarks, Historic Landmarks of Indiana. It was then, now Indiana Landmarks. He was interested in the city. A very young Mayor Lugar came to see him in 1972 to talk about the deteriorating city market. And that conversation led to moving outward into the entire downtown. And not by accident, a few months after that meeting of the mayor and Eli Lilly, Jim Morris, the mayor's chief assistant, moved from the mayor's office to the Lilly Endowment. In many ways, that was the beginning of the new Indianapolis. Lilly money began to flow into the city. There are many other beneficiaries. I have to mention the Children's Museum, and the saddest place in the Children's Museum. This is Evie's Playhouse. I take my grandchildren up there, and they laugh and run and enjoy. We ride the carousel, and then we go play in the Playhouse. And I can almost shed a tear seeing the Playhouse. They think it's wonderful. And of course, these gifts included the Indianapolis Museum of Art. He began, right after World War II, to collect Chinese porcelain, bronze, jade. And like a lot of things he did, when it became a passion, it became a big passion, and it involved a fair bit of money being spent. And the leading dealer in these objects coming out from New York numerous times with suitcases full of stuff. It was not just the object, it was what it meant. So he started to read about Chinese culture, Chinese history, Chinese religion. And he liked the beauty and the tranquility that he thought were embodied in these porcelains and other objects. These objects, of course, these collections became part of the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And he became, by the 1960s, deeply involved in what will become the Indianapolis Museum of Art. He helped with the gift of old fields that his niece and nephew made. He helped with numerous significant financial contributions. And very importantly, he gave by serving on the board and by making phone calls and conversations. He gave his seal of approval to this institution as he worked with Kurt Panzer to recruit Herman Krannert and George Clowes, and I don't need to tell you who those names are. The result, some of this building opened in 1970, He was asked to speak. He refused to speak. He refused to have his name on any part of the building or to speak at the dedication. He wrote, "I know nothing about art or speaking. I hope to enjoy the proceedings from the back row." And that's where he sat. Thus, when he purchased a painting, and this will reflect my unsophistication in areas of art, it's my favorite painting in this museum. I love this painting. It's Washington Street in the late 19th century. It came on the market, and he bought it for the museum and asked that the label read that it was a gift from a couple of old Hoosiers. Ruth and Eli Lilly. Their names are not on the label. Last time I checked, it was a gift still from a couple of old Hoosiers. I think when you walk through the galleries, it's not hard to find, look at it, and think about it in so many ways. He continued his support in the 70s when the museum struggled with the new building and other issues. He wrote that he had to continue to support it because it was a great asset to the city, and the good citizens of Indianapolis cannot afford to let it fall on its face. He knew what this museum was for the city, and he took visitors to the city to see it, proudly saying, "We have something more now than just the Indianapolis 500 racetrack to show you." He was not interested in contemporary art. When the museum did an exhibit on contemporary art in the early 70s, he made from scraps of wood. He had a wood shop on Sunset Lane, loved to work with wood. He took some of his scraps of wood and put some wire and feathers to make this sculpture for a contemporary art exhibit. He called it Winged Victory of Sammy's Place. And the director who was in on this put it in the exhibit, and the two of them had a great yuck over this piece of contemporary art. He was a man of his time and place, as we all are people of our time and place. The company policies on McCarty Street in the 1930s and 40s were not progressive on issues of race or religion. But that changed in the late 40s and the 50s. And by the end of the 50s, Eli Lilly and Company could boast that it was one of the best places to work in the whole United States, that it had changed. And it, of course, has changed radically on those issues down to our own time. He struggled with other changes. One of my favorites is one of my granddaughters loves Grease, the music. And he struggled. He went to see a performance of Grease, a live performance at Clowes Hall in 1973, and was appalled. These people weren't in it, but they were wearing skimpy clothing and singing about things that looked an awful lot like sex. And he was appalled, so appalled that he resigned. He didn't do this very often. He resigned from the advisory board of Clowes Hall quietly, anonymously. Was never announced, but he continued to make his financial contributions to Clowes Hall. A man of his time and place, sure, but a man who stepped out of his time and place, to fundamental, enduring questions, issues, values. He died in 1977, age 91. His will listed his beneficiaries. The favorite ones received many millions of dollars, including the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And we could follow that money trail, and there are some interesting tracks on that trail, even down to the present. I would like to close with two aspects of his ending. In 1976, the year before he died, Eli Lilly and Company celebrated its centennial. It was a grand celebration at the convention center, all kinds of hoopla and stuff. Eli Lilly arrived quietly in the middle of the event There was no announcement that he had entered the hall. There was no introduction, no trumpets, no strings for the man who more than any other had built one of the world's most successful pharmaceutical companies. When asked before the event about planning it, he said he insisted on only one point. These are his words: no rock and roll music like we had at our last 25-year dinner. And then he went on to say that the music should include Stephen Foster, Gilbert and Sullivan, and Strauss waltzes. No Elvis, no Beatles, not even Benny Goodman. He actually sat with Benny Goodman when he performed on Sunset Lane, and he wrote a friend later, intermission, Benny Goodman came over and sat down beside Mr. Lilly, and he wrote a friend later, actually, he's not a bad guy. Sounds like my father talking. On the occasion of the centennial, he looked backward to the music of his old days, of his youth. But he was the man again who so often looked forward, who had pushed the changes, the revolutionary changes at McCarty Street, who had sought so intensely a proper outlook on life. And then there's his funeral service. He made a few simple requests. The most important was that there would be no eulogies, no remarks whatsoever. His notion of character, this boring man's notion of character, of a proper outlook on life, was not about keeping score with eulogies or tributes, or certainly not dollar amounts. His examined life, his passions, led him to other more important matters. A life well lived, I think, with consequences for the Indianapolis Museum of Art, for this city, for this state, for this nation, for this world. I'd be happy now to answer some questions, and again, I want to apologize for skipping over a very long and eventful life, but I do want to have an opportunity for comments and questions, and there may be someone in the audience who knew Mr. Lilly and has a story you want to tell. I'd be happy to hear that story, and I'd be happy to have other comments and questions. Yes?
I actually met him when I was a girl. I worked as a research person for Charles Eager under Hubert Hawkins at the Indiana Historical Society. And he came in and four of us kids, we were in college at the time. And a few years later, I got a scholarship, a fellowship to go to IU under the Lilly Endowment Program because he thought that history teaching of U.S. history was poor, and I got one of his fellowships.
Did you all hear that? This is a person who met Mr. Lilly as a young person working at the Indiana Historical Society and ended up getting a Lilly Endowment Scholarship to study at Indiana University, study history. And I want to say, I mentioned it continues on. This is a chance to put in a little plug for a project that's very dear to my heart. As Karen said, I'm involved sometimes too much in the bicentennial, but be careful what you wish for. And the bicentennial is really going to be a wonderful, wonderful event. I hope you're all engaged in one way or another. One of my favorite projects, I co-authored an Indiana history textbook for high school and middle school students. And we're doing workshops around the state for teachers, and all teachers who come to these workshops get free copies of the book for their classroom, 30 or 40 copies to each teacher. It's a handsome book, published by the Indiana Historical Society, full color pages, very beautiful. These workshops, the textbook, the whole project is funded by hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Lilly Endowment. And I'd like to think, I never say what Mr. Lilly would have thought about something today, but I can't imagine that he would have loved, and what your comment says is, he would have loved this book going into schoolrooms across the state of Indiana, still with money that he made. Yes?
I don't have a personal anecdote, but when I joined Lilly in 1983, there were still people who knew about history.
It was shocking to me too, because this is the Lilly I knew of. And when I started working on this book in the mid-1980s, there was virtually no one around who knew the young Lilly, the temper tantrum, the impatient Lilly. This is why historians need primary sources in forms other than memory. The memory of Lilly was the one you said, the kind man who came down and had a Coke in the company cafeteria, who talked to young students, who was very gentlemanly and very avuncular. That's not the young Lilly, and the record on that is absolutely clear. I have no doubt about that. They're I don't want to say two different people, that's too much. But those differences are fundamental to my understanding of the story of his life, which is why I go on about these personal details that become part of the public consequences. Yes? It's written again and again in documents and papers and memoirs at Eli Lilly and Company archives. The archives there are phenomenal, huge. This room would not contain all the paper down there, just in the period of Eli Lilly's life. And there are all kinds of, the most telling, letters from his own father, who say, cool it, young kid, slow down a little bit, be a little kinder to our employees. His own father writes him that way. And he sometimes writes in response. They had offices right across the hall. His father would come over, and he sometimes gets upset with things his father says to him. And, his father's trying to hose him down a little bit, and he writes to his brother or someone else. The record here is just, there's no doubt in my mind, because the record, the numbers of pieces of paper, of actual documents that report these kinds of things. And there are the company did do in the 1950s some oral history interviews with older retired employees, and some of the older employees remember this too. And by this time, they probably toned it down a little bit, but they're telling stories of someone fired on the spot for mixing the wrong chemicals in a barrel, Go ahead, follow up. I don't know enough to comment on Steve Jobs, but I know enough about leaders in business and elsewhere to know that some of them are mean SOBs. And sometimes that's what's called leadership in some circumstances, in some ways, and we all have our own definitions of what a mean SOB might be and what might be the good and positive consequences of that and what might be the negative consequences of that. I guess the takeaway that I would emphasize here is the obvious one, the simple common sense one, which is so easy to lose and miss when we have a great man like this. He was a human being. He was a human being. He lived his life in full color with all the stuff that people live their lives. He had his own trials and tribulations, lots of them. Yes, here.
In your book, I was interested in finding out about the relationship with his own mother and how that played out into his first wife and so forth. That might have some bearing.
Yeah. The question is his relationship with his mother. And I don't believe in psychoanalysis of the living. Well, I don't know about the living, but certainly not the dead. I don't want to be Eli Lilly's psychiatrist. But you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see in the record again, in his own words, that his relationship with his mother was troubled. She was one of the shy Lillys. They were all shy. The colonel, maybe less so. But J.K. Sr. and his two sons were very shy people. They had to force themselves. J.K. Jr. spent much of his time, collecting stamps and military figures and books. Eli Lilly, more outgoing, but very shy. And in Eli's case, not a good relationship with his mother. In his own, when he several times sat down and wrote little memoirs of his childhood, he worshipped his grandfather, the colonel. His mother, he says very little about. One of the few memories he writes about his mother is that she had a hairbrush and she used it to give him a whipping, often. And then he writes about, he was, how old was he, 6 or 8 when J.K. Jr. was born. And he says, in his own writing, that his younger brother was the favorite. That when he came into the house, he was second to the baby and to the man. And his mother had a variety of issues, some physical issues later on, I think also perhaps some personality, emotional issues that made their relationship, mother and son, a troubled one, and maybe more than just troubled. Again, I don't have enough evidence to go as far as a good Hollywood gossip reporter could take this story and, whoa, I'd be on whatever current reality show there is about this stuff. I saw another hand. Yes.
What role did his brother have in the company?
Very good question. Thank you for answering that. What role did his brother, J.K. Jr., have in the company? And because I wrote a biography of Eli, the older brother, it's inevitable, I guess, that I shortchange J.K. Jr. And I probably should even apologize for doing that, but I didn't I say, well, someone ought to write, and this is very true, someone ought to write a biography of all 3 of these other Lillys. There's no biography of the Colonel. There's no biography of J.K. Sr. There's no biography of J.K. Jr. yet. Of all the 3 generations, I wrote the best biography. It's the only one. And because there is none of the others, and because people would like one of all of the others, they tend to rely on my work. But I didn't set out to tell the story of J. It's a huge story. It's an amazing story, J.K. Jr. and the other 2 Lilly men. They were very different. I think they were loving brothers. They certainly respected each other. They had differences, serious differences over the Lilly endowment in the early 1960s when it moved into very conservative politics because J.K. Jr. moved it that way to Eli Lilly's great regret. They had differences in the company, but they tended to give a united face to the public, and their father always said that. We got to hang together. We 3 Lilly boys have to hang together here. Don't let outsiders, and he meant other people in the company, much less outside the company, see us divided. They were not close friends. The example I gave of Eli never sitting down with his brother and having a heart-to-heart about Evie is a very telling example about their relationship. That was the kind of relationship they had. It was brotherly, they were siblings, but not close and not on the same wavelength. And so, again, the example I gave, J.K. collected books. They're now in the Lilly Library at Indiana University, Bloomington. It's one of the finest rare book collections in the world. Eli never understood this. I mean, he respected it, but it was to him. Books are to read, not to collect. J.K. Jr. was less engaged in the company. He did his duty. It was a family duty. Some of it he enjoyed. He was interested in marketing research, but he didn't have the kind of, again, I haven't written his biography, so I should qualify this just a little bit. I don't think he had the kind of commitment to the pill factory that his brother Eli had. And he retired early on. Eli never retired. He kept, long after he was no longer in active leadership, he kept going down to his office. He had a chauffeur who would drive him in his later years who had throat cancer and couldn't talk, and Eli Lilly was very deaf. He had hearing aids. He could play tunes on his hearing aids. He'd do that for kids. And he said on one occasion, "We're the perfect pair, Peter. You can't talk and I can't hear." Yes.
I came here in 1960, right after World War II. And it wasn't long before things happened that I heard about this man.
That's about the way I saw him. I was at some kind of history event. It's probably the Indiana Historical Society history event on Wabash College campus, and I saw him across the way. That's as close as I ever got to him. So I can't be accused of having a personal relationship with him. But you mentioned his historic preservation. I mentioned that in passing, but it's phenomenally important. Indiana, you may not know this, but you can go to any professional historic preservation organization or individual, and they will be deeply jealous of what we have here in Indiana in the form of landmarks and in the form of local preservation action beginning in the 1950s on Main Street in Madison, Indiana, one of the most beautiful towns in the country. And Lilly's money was there and his presence was there. He and Ruth would go down to Madison to see what was happening, to visit some of the first of the preservation people in Madison. He was deeply attuned to the significance of old buildings, to the significance of preserving them and making them as teaching tools, again, for values, for understanding our culture, our civilization. And he spent a lot, not just his money. Again, and that's what's important. I said this, I emphasize it. It's not just his money. The money sure is important because there was so much of it. But it's his engagement in these issues that he gave, most of them, that he gave to, his connection, his hands-on. And preservation is a phenomenal example of that with landmarks, with Conner Prairie, with other preservation projects around the state. So yes. Karen's going to pull me away, I guess. Huh?
Yes. A round of applause for Dr. Yeah, I'm afraid that you could go on with many interesting stories to tell us, but you have a commitment this afternoon. We would like to give this to you as our thank you for being here today. And Dr. Madison's book is for sale outside on the registration table, and he'll sign it. He'll be out there. And if you would turn in your surveys that were handed out today, they'll be collected at the exit. And thank you for coming, and another round of applause for Dr. Madison.